Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Whistling in the Pines. The four of them had been friends since high school. Megan, Josh, Tyler, and Kara. And this trip to the mountains was supposed to be a break from their adult lives. They were all in their late 20s now, with jobs that drained them and responsibilities that hung over them like storm clouds. Megan had suggested camping, and after some persuasion, everyone had agreed. Fresh air, no cell service, and a weekend to unwind. It sounded perfect. They chose an isolated trail deep in the Oregon wilderness. The ranger at the station had warned them, the forest gets real dense up there. Easy to lose your way if you're not careful. And some folks say strange things happen in those woods. Josh had laughed it off. Strange things? Like Bigfoot. The ranger gave a half smile. Something like that. Just stick to the main trail. Of course they didn't. The first day of hiking was idyllic. The sun filtered through the tall pines, and the air smelled of sap and moss. They pitched their tents in a clearing by dusk, sharing laughs and stories around the campfire. But it was on the second day, as they ventured farther into the forest, that they found the grove. It wasn't on the map. The pines here were impossibly tall, their trunks thick and ancient, their branches so dense they nearly blocked out the sun. The air was cooler, quieter. Even the birds seemed reluctant to chirp. Megan felt the hairs on her arms stand up. "This is creepy," Kara said, hugging herself. Josh grinned. "Creepy? It's just trees." But Megan couldn't shake the feeling. "Let's just keep moving," she said. "We should find a good spot to camp before it gets dark." They pushed on, but the grove seemed endless, the pines towering around them in every direction. By the time they found a suitable clearing, the sun was sinking behind the mountains, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the forest floor. That night, it started. Megan woke first. She'd always been a light sleeper, and the sound was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of the trees. But as she lay still in her sleeping bag, she realized it wasn't the wind. It was whistling, soft, rhythmic, and oddly melodic. It seemed to come from the grove. She glanced at her watch, 3:12 a.m., then at the others. Kara snored softly in her tent. Josh and Tyler were silent. Megan tried to tell herself it was nothing, just the wind playing tricks. She pulled the sleeping bag tighter around her and forced herself to sleep. In the morning, Megan didn't mention the whistling. Maybe it was her imagination. But as they packed up their campsite, Kara frowned. "Did anyone hear?" "I don't know, whistling last night," she asked hesitantly. Megan froze. "You heard it too?" Josh and Tyler exchanged looks. "It was probably the wind," Josh said dismissively, but Megan saw the flicker of unease in his eyes. They moved on, the trail winding deeper into the forest. The pines seemed to grow closer together, their shadows darker. By evening, they found another clearing, though Megan thought the air felt heavier here. That night, the whistling was louder. Megan woke to the sound and lay still, her heart pounding. It wasn't just a random tune. It had a pattern, a rising and falling melody that was almost hypnotic. She crawled out of her tent, and looked around. The fire had died to embers, and the forest was cloaked in shadows. Then she saw Josh. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, his back to her, staring into the trees. "Josh," she whispered, her voice shaking. He didn't respond. The whistling grew louder, coming from deep within the grove. Megan felt a cold dread wash over her. She grabbed his arm, and he blinked as if waking from a trance. "What are you doing?" she hissed. I thought I heard someone," he murmured, his voice distant. They returned to their tents, but Megan didn't sleep. In the morning, Josh was gone. His tent was empty, his pack untouched. The others called his name, their voices echoing through the trees, but there was no response. Megan's chest tightened as they found tracks leading into the grove. Why would he go off alone? Kara asked, her voice trembling. Maybe he got up early and went exploring, Tyler said, though he didn't sound convinced. They followed the tracks. They led deeper into the grove, where the pines grew so thick that sunlight barely penetrated. The whistling started again, faint but unmistakable, and then the tracks ended. No sign of Josh, no explanation. Just a cluster of claw marks on the trees, as if something had scraped its way through. By the time they returned to the clearing, it was late afternoon. The tension was palpable. Megan couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. "We need to leave," she said firmly. Josh wouldn't just disappear. But what about him? Kara asked. "We can't just leave him out here." Megan didn't have an answer. The forest felt alive, oppressive. They built a fire that night and sat in silence, too afraid to speak. The whistling came again, louder than ever. It seemed to circle the clearing, moving through the trees. Megan clenched her fists, resisting the pull to follow it. But Tyler didn't. "I hear him," Tyler said suddenly, standing up. "It's Josh. He's calling for help." "No, it's not," Megan yelled, grabbing his arm. "Stay here." But Tyler wrenched free and ran into the darkness. Megan and Kara screamed after him, but the whistling drowned out their voices. And then silence. When dawn broke, they found Tyler's flashlight near the edge of the grove, its beam pointing to more claw marks on the trees. Kara was sobbing now, her face pale. Megan forced herself to stay calm. "We're leaving," she said. "Now." They packed in record time, but the forest seemed to shift around them. Every path led them back to the grove. The whistling followed them, mocking and relentless. By dusk, Kara was gone. Megan didn't see her leave. One moment, she was there, and the next, she wasn't. Only the faint echo of her scream remained. Megan was alone now. The whistling surrounded her, closing in. She stumbled through the grove, her breath ragged, her legs trembling. The pines loomed over her, their clawed branches reaching. And then she saw it. A figure stood in the shadows, its eyes glinting. It was shaped like a bear, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its movements too human. It opened its maw, and the whistling poured out, deafening and endless. Megan ran. She didn't stop until she burst out of the grove and into the open air. The sun was rising, painting the sky in hues of gold. But she was alone. The ranger found her days later, wandering near the trailhead, her clothes torn, her eyes hollow. She tried to tell them about the whistling, about the grove, but they didn't believe her. No one ever does. And the grove still waits, deep in the pines, for its next visitors. Story 2. The lantern that never went out. The lake was a mirror, glass still under the pale moonlight. The Harrington family, Mark, his wife Jessica, and their teenage son Ben, had driven 8 hours to get here, a remote corner of Idaho they'd read about in an old camping guide. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth, and the silence was a welcome change from the hum of city life. Mark set up the tent while Jessica unpacked their gear. Ben wandered to the edge of the lake, tossing stones and watching the ripples spread across the water. It was idyllic, quiet, peaceful, but then they saw the lantern. It hung from a crooked branch of a gnarled pine tree about 20 feet from their tent, swaying ever so slightly in the breeze. The lantern was old, its metal rusted and covered in cobwebs. Its glass panes were clouded with grime, but inside, a faint yellow glow pulsed like a heartbeat. "Did you put that there?" Jessica asked, glancing at Mark. "No," Mark said, frowning. He approached the lantern, tilting his head to study it. "Probably left by another camper. It's kind of cool, actually. Adds to the atmosphere." Ben joined them, squinting at the lantern. "It's glowing, but there's no battery pack or wires." Jessica crossed her arms. "It's probably one of those solar-powered ones. Let's just leave it alone. We didn't come here to mess with old junk." Mark shrugged, but as he stepped back, he couldn't shake the feeling that the lantern was watching them. That night, after dinner and a few rounds of ghost stories, they retreated to the tent. The fire crackled low, casting flickering shadows on the trees. Mark woke first, just past midnight. Something had pulled him from his sleep, a faint sound, like metal scraping against wood. He peeked out of the tent and froze. The lantern was hanging closer now, from a tree directly above their campsite. Its glow was brighter, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. "Jessica," he whispered, shaking her awake. She groaned, blinking up at him. "What is it?" "The lantern. It moved." Jessica sighed, but when she looked outside, her annoyance melted into unease. "That's not possible. It wasn't here before," Mark said, his voice low. Ben stirred, crawling over to the tent's entrance. "What's going on?" Mark gestured to the lantern. Ben's face paled. "Let's take it down," Mark said, grabbing a stick from the fire. "Don't," Jessica hissed. "Just leave it. It's not hurting anyone." "It's creeping me out," Ben muttered. Mark ignored them, approaching the tree. The lantern seemed to hum faintly, as if it were alive. He reached up with the stick, nudging it free from the branch. It fell with a dull thud, its glow extinguished. "See?" Mark said, picking it up. "Just an old." The light flickered back on, brighter than before. Mark dropped the lantern with a yelp. It rolled onto its side, the glow pulsating angrily. "Let's just go back to sleep," Jessica said, pulling Ben toward the tent. "It's nothing." Mark hesitated, but eventually followed. The next morning, the lantern was gone. Relieved, they packed up to move to a new spot farther from the lake. But when they arrived at their new campsite a few miles away, The lantern was waiting for them, hanging from a tree in the middle of the clearing. Jessica gasped. "This is impossible." Mark's face was pale. "Someone's messing with us." "Oh, we haven't seen anyone all day," Ben said, his voice trembling. Mark approached the lantern again, but this time, as he reached for it, the glow dimmed, and a low, guttural whisper filled the air. It was unintelligible, a rasping murmur that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Did you hear that?" he asked, stepping back. Jessica nodded, clutching Ben's arm. That night, the whispers grew louder. They echoed through the trees, rising and falling like a sinister chant. None of them could sleep. By the third day, they were desperate to leave. They packed their gear and hiked back to their car, but when they reached the parking area, the lantern was hanging from a signpost, glowing faintly in the midday sun. "How is this happening?" Jessica whispered, her voice shaking. "We're leaving it," Mark said firmly, shoving their gear into the trunk. They drove for hours, determined to put as much distance between them and the lantern as possible. But when they stopped at a roadside motel for the night, the lantern was waiting for them, perched on a chair outside their room. Jessica broke down, sobbing. "We can't escape it." Mark grabbed it, shaking it furiously. "What do you want from us?" he shouted. The glow intensified, and for a brief moment, the lantern's light cast a shadow against the wall, a shadow of a man in tattered clothing, holding a pickaxe. That night, Mark did some research on his phone. He found an old newspaper article about a prospector named Elias Grady, who had vanished near the lake in the late 1800s. Grady had been searching for a legendary treasure rumored to be hidden beneath the lake. According to the article, Grady was last seen carrying a lantern, muttering about how he would never let anyone else have it. Jessica stared at the screen, her face pale. "It's him. The lantern belongs to him." Mark nodded grimly. "And he's not going to stop until we give it back." "But how?" Ben asked. The family returned to the lake, the lantern glowing brighter with each step. They placed it on the shore and backed away, watching as the glow became blinding. The water rippled violently, and a figure emerged, a gaunt, skeletal man with hollow eyes and a rusted pickaxe. He reached for the lantern, cradling it like a lost child. Then, without a word, he turned and walked into the lake. The water swallowed him whole, and the lantern's glow faded into darkness. The Harringtons never camped again, but sometimes, on quiet nights by the lake, locals claimed to see a faint yellow glow beneath the water, pulsing like a heartbeat. Story 3. Shadows in the campfire. The fire crackled in the middle of the clearing, sending sparks into the cool autumn air. For friends, Jenny, Mark, Lisa, and Kyle sat around it, wrapped in blankets and clutching cups of hot cocoa. The forest loomed dark and silent around them, a wall of towering pines that seemed to lean closer as the night deepened. Jenny leaned forward, her face lit orange by the flames. "All right," she said, her voice low and teasing. "Who's got the scariest story tonight?" Lisa shivered and pulled her blanket tighter. "Let's not get too spooky, okay? This place already feels creepy enough." "Oh, come on," Mark said with a grin. "What's a camping trip without ghost stories?" "Kyle, you're up. Tell us something terrifying." Kyle shrugged, his lanky frame silhouetted against the fire. Fine, he said, setting down his mug. But don't blame me if you can't sleep. He launched into a story about a haunted forest ranger station, his voice rising and falling with practiced drama. Jenny gasped in all the right places. Lisa kept nervously glancing over her shoulder, and Mark kept pretending not to be impressed. But as Kyle spoke, Jenny noticed something odd. The shadows cast by the fire, long and flickering across the trees, seemed to move differently. They stretched too far, curling unnaturally against the bark like claws. She blinked and shook her head. It was just the firelight, she told herself. By the time Kyle finished, the shadows had settled back to normal. That was decent, Mark said, tossing another log into the fire. But I can do better. He launched into a tale about a cursed hiker who wandered the forest, doomed to stalk anyone who lit a fire in his domain. His voice was low and gravelly, his tone menacing. Jenny leaned back, trying to enjoy the story, but her eyes kept drifting to the shadows. They danced wildly now, stretching and contorting like living things. One shadow in particular, a tall, thin figure, moved differently. It seemed to lean toward the fire, its arms outstretched. Hey, do you guys see that? Jenny interrupted, her voice trembling. Mark paused. See what? Jenny pointed to the trees. The others turned to look, their faces flickering with confusion. Nothing, Lisa said. Just shadows. Jenny nodded, but her stomach twisted. She swore she saw that shadow twitch, like it had hurt her. The stories continued. Lisa told one about a ghostly bride, her voice shaking with every word. The fire hissed and popped, the smoke curling into the night. By the time Lisa finished, the forest felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. All right, Jenny, Mark said. You're the last one. Give us your best shot. Jenny shook her head. I'm not really in the mood. Come on, Kyle urged. Just something short. We're not letting you off the hook. She sighed and began a half-hearted story about a haunted campsite. But as she spoke, her voice faltered. The shadows were moving again. They weren't flickering with the fire anymore. They were flowing, twisting across the ground like water. Guys, she said, stopping mid-sentence. Something's wrong. What now? Mark groaned. The shadows, she whispered. There. Before she could finish, the tall shadow she'd noticed earlier surged forward, slipping across the ground like ink. It wrapped around Kyle's feet, climbing up his body. Kyle moved. Jenny screamed, but Kyle didn't seem to notice. He just sat there, staring blankly into the fire. Kyle! Mark shouted, grabbing his friend's arm. But when he touched Kyle, he recoiled. His hand was freezing, like he'd touched a block of ice. The shadow continued to climb, wrapping around Kyle's chest and neck. Then, with a final flicker, it disappeared into him. Kyle blinked and looked around. What's wrong? He asked, his voice flat. You didn't see that? Lisa stammered. See what? Kyle asked, tilting his head. His movements were jerky, unnatural. Jenny gasped. Your shadow. They all looked down. The fire cast their shadows long and dark on the ground, except for Kyle. There was nothing behind him. Mark backed away, pulling Lisa with him. This isn't funny, Kyle. I'm not joking. Kyle said, but his voice sounded wrong, hollow. He stood up, his body stiff and awkward, and stepped closer to the fire. "Stay back," Jenny shouted, but Kyle didn't stop. As he moved, the fire dimmed. The shadows around them grew darker, stretching toward the group like reaching hands. "Run!" Jenny yelled. They bolted into the forest, crashing through the undergrowth. The firelight faded behind them, but the shadows didn't. They chased the campers, slithering across the ground and up the trees. Jenny tripped and fell, scraping her hands on the dirt. She looked back and saw Kyle standing at the edge of the firelight, watching them. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and behind him, the shadows swirled like living things. "Keep running," Mark shouted, pulling Jenny to her feet. They didn't stop until they reached the trailhead where their car was parked. Jenny glanced back one last time, but the shadows were gone. The forest was silent again. They piled into the car and sped away, not daring to speak until they were miles from the campsite. "What the hell happened back there?" Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. Jenny shook her head. "I don't know, but we're never going back." The next morning, rangers found their abandoned campsite. The fire had burned out, leaving nothing but ashes, and a single shadow scorched into the ground, shaped like a tall, thin figure with outstretched arms. Story 4. The Lake of Still Faces. Jake and Trevor had always been drawn to the wilderness. Best friends since childhood, they prided themselves on being the adventurous type. Their trips were often impulsive, driven by a need to escape the grind of everyday life. This time, Trevor suggested they try a place he'd found on an old map, a small, unnamed lake nestled deep in a national forest, miles from the nearest road. "It's perfect," Trevor had said, grinning as he spread the map across Jake's kitchen table. "No people, no noise, just us and nature." Jake hesitated. "How come it's not on any modern maps? Maybe there's a reason." "Exactly," Trevor countered. "It's untouched. Come on, man. Aren't you tired of the crowded campsites?" Reluctantly, Jake agreed. He liked the quiet too, but something about the idea of an unnamed lake nagged at him. Still, he packed his gear and followed Trevor into the woods that Friday morning. The lake was indeed secluded. After hours of hiking through dense forest, they finally broke through the trees and saw it. A perfect oval of water, smooth as glass, reflecting the overcast sky like a mirror. The surrounding pines towered over the shoreline, their dark branches tangled like the fingers of old giants. "Man, this is incredible," Trevor said, dropping his pack. He knelt at the water's edge, scooping a handful to taste. "Clean too. This is going to be great." Jake wasn't so sure. Something about the lake unsettled him. The air felt colder here, and the water's surface was unnaturally still. There wasn't even a ripple, despite the occasional breeze rustling the treetops. "You notice anything weird about it?" Jake asked. Trevor shrugged. "It's calm, peaceful. That's the point, right?" Jake nodded, but his unease lingered. They set up camp near the shore, building a small fire and pitching their tent. As night fell, the silence became oppressive. There were no frogs croaking, no insects buzzing. Even the wind seemed muted. "This is strange," Jake said, staring out at the water. It's too quiet. You're paranoid, Trevor replied, tossing another log on the fire. Relax. You're just not used to this kind of solitude. Jake tried to convince himself Trevor was right. But as the flames crackled and the hours stretched on, his eyes kept drifting to the lake. Its surface remained impossibly smooth, reflecting the moonlight in a way that made it seem like a sheet of silver. Around midnight, Trevor yawned. I'm calling it. Don't stay up too late freaking yourself out. Jake nodded but stayed by the fire after Trevor crawled into the tent. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The first face appeared just after Jake put out the fire. He was about to stand when he noticed something in the water. A shimmer, like a ripple, but the lake was still. Then, slowly, a face emerged just below the surface. Pale, with wide, staring eyes, and an expression of frozen terror. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light. When he looked again, the face was gone. Trev, he hissed, scrambling to the tent. Trevor, wake up. Trevor groaned. What now? There was a face in the water. Trevor sat up, rubbing his eyes. What are you talking about? Jake gestured frantically toward the lake. I saw a face. In the water. I swear. Trevor sighed and grabbed a flashlight. Fine. Let's go look. The two of them stood at the water's edge, Jake clutching Trevor's arm tightly. Trevor shone the beam of the flashlight across the surface, but there was nothing. See? Just a lake, Trevor said, shaking his head. You're spooking yourself. But then the light caught something, a reflection, just below the surface. Slowly, more faces appeared. Dozens of them, pale and ghostly, their unblinking eyes fixed on the two men. Holy, Trevor whispered, stumbling back. The faces didn't move, didn't ripple. They just stared, their expressions identical. Mouths slightly open, as if caught in a silent scream. Let's get out of here, Jake said, his voice trembling. Trevor nodded, and they hurried back to the tent. Neither of them slept that night. By morning, the faces were gone, but the lake's eerie stillness remained. The two packed up their gear quickly, eager to leave. But when they reached the trail they had come on, it wasn't there. The forest seemed different. Paths twisted in unfamiliar directions, and landmarks they remembered were missing. We're lost, Jake said, panic creeping into his voice. Trevor tried to stay calm. No, we're not. We just need to retrace our steps. They spent hours wandering, but every path led them back to the lake. By the time the sun began to set, Jake was shaking. We're trapped here. That lake, it's not natural. Don't start. Trevor snapped. We'll figure it out. That night, as they sat by the fire, the faces returned. This time, they were closer, their features clearer. Some looked human, others grotesque, with elongated jaws and hollow eyes. One face broke the surface, water dripping from its open mouth as it grinned. They're coming, Jake whispered. The lake began to ripple, and shapes rose from the water. The faces weren't just watching anymore. They were emerging, dragging themselves onto the shore. The first figure was skeletal, its skin translucent and dripping. It reached for Trevor, who grabbed a burning log from the fire and swung it wildly. Run, he shouted. Jake bolted, not caring where he was going. Behind him, he heard Trevor's screams, followed by the sound of splashing water. He didn't look back. Jake ran until his legs gave out, collapsing in a clearing far from the lake. He waited for hours, but Trevor never came. When dawn broke, Jake found the trail again. It led him back to civilization, but he couldn't bring himself to tell anyone what had happened. To this day, Jake dreams of the lake. In those dreams, Trevor's face stares up at him from beneath the water, unblinking and pale. And he knows, one day, the lake will call him back. Story 5, The Silent Trail. Karen adjusted the straps on her backpack and glanced at her husband, David, who was already a few steps ahead, consulting their trail map. The afternoon sun filtered through the towering pines, casting long shadows on the forest floor. The crisp mountain air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. "This map's useless," David said, shaking his head. "It says there's a trailhead up here, but I don't see anything." Karen stepped closer, peering over his shoulder. The map was worn, the edges frayed from years of use. They had picked it up at the ranger station earlier that morning. "Maybe it's an old map," she suggested. "Trails come and go." David sighed and folded the map, shoving it into his pocket. "Let's keep going. Worst case, we'll turn back." They trudged on, their boots crunching on the gravel path. Karen loved the solitude of the forest. It was why she and David had chosen this particular park. No crowds, no cell service, just the two of them and nature. But as they walked, something began to feel off. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping birds, rustling leaves, the distant trickle of a stream, faded into an eerie silence. Karen stopped and looked around. "Do you hear that?" she asked. David paused, tilting his head. "Hear what?" "That's the thing. There's nothing to hear." David frowned. "Maybe the wildlife's just shy. We're pretty deep in the woods." But his voice wavered slightly, betraying his unease. They continued walking, the silence pressing down on them like a heavy blanket. Karen noticed the wind had stopped too. The air was unnervingly still, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Then they saw it, a narrow dirt trail veering off to the right, almost hidden by overgrown bushes. "That's not on the map," David said. Karen hesitated. "Do you think it's a game trail?" David examined the trailhead. It was too wide, too well-trodden to be for animals. "I don't think so. Let's check it out. If it gets sketchy, we'll turn around." Reluctantly, Karen followed him. The further they walked, the stranger the forest became. The trees grew taller and closer together, their gnarled branches intertwining overhead. The sunlight dimmed, casting everything in a twilight gloom. And the silence, it wasn't just quiet, it was absolute. No rustling leaves, no buzzing insects, just the sound of their breathing and the crunch of their boots. Karen felt a chill crawl up her spine. "David, I don't like this. We'll just see where it leads," he said, though his voice was tense. After what felt like an eternity, the trail opened into a clearing. In the center stood a lone swing set, its metal frame rusted and its chains dangling. One swing moved, creaking slowly back and forth, even though there was no wind. "What the hell?" David whispered, Karen's chest tightened. This doesn't make any sense. Why would there be a swing set out here? David walked toward it, his boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. It looks ancient, he said, brushing his fingers against the chains. They were cold, colder than they should have been in the afternoon sun. Maybe it's from an old campground. Karen stayed back, her eyes scanning the clearing. The forest pressed in around them, the trees forming an impenetrable wall. She couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. "Let's go," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't like this place." David nodded. "Yeah, this is weird." They turned back to the trail, but something was wrong. The path they had just walked was gone. In its place was dense underbrush, as if the trail had never existed. "What the?" David muttered, spinning in circles. "Where's the trail?" Karen's heart pounded. Maybe we missed it? Let's walk around the clearing. They circled the perimeter, but there was no sign of the path. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole. "We'll just pick a direction and go," David said, trying to sound confident. "We'll hit a trail eventually." Karen nodded, though dread coiled in her stomach. They pushed through the underbrush, the branches clawing at their clothes. But after several minutes of walking, they emerged back into the clearing. Karen's breath hitched. No, this isn't possible." David looked pale. "We must have gotten turned around." They tried again, choosing a different direction. And again, they found themselves back in the clearing. Each time, the swing creaked as if mocking them. Panic set in. "What's happening, David?" Karen whispered, tears welling in her eyes. David shook his head, his jaw clenched. "I don't know, but we're not staying here. Keep moving." They walked for hours, or at least it felt like hours. The sky remained an unchanging gray, and their watches had stopped working. Each time, no matter which direction they took, they ended up back at the clearing. Karen was sobbing now, exhaustion and fear overwhelming her. "We're never getting out? Are we?" David hugged her tightly, his own face etched with despair. "Don't say that. We'll figure it out." As night fell, the swing's creaking grew louder, echoing in the oppressive silence. Shadows danced at the edge of the clearing, just out of sight. Karen thought she saw figures moving among the trees, tall, thin, and unnaturally still. "David," she whispered, clutching his arm. "Something's out there." He followed her gaze, his face pale. "Stay close to me." The shadows began to inch closer, their movements jerky and unnatural. Karen and David backed toward the center of the clearing, their eyes darting in every direction. "What do they want?" Karen whimpered. The swing stopped creaking. The silence was absolute again, but this time it was suffocating. One shadow stepped into the clearing, its face hidden in darkness. It raised a hand, pointing toward the swing. "No," Karen whispered, shaking her head. "We're not playing your game." The figure tilted its head, as if amused. Then the swing began to move again, faster this time, its chains rattling like laughter. David grabbed Karen's hand. "Run!" They sprinted into the forest, not caring about the trail or the direction. The trees seemed to close in around them, the branches snagging at their clothes. The shadows pursued them, silent and relentless. Karen didn't know how long they ran, but eventually her legs gave out and she collapsed to the ground. David dropped beside her, gasping for breath. When they looked up, they were back in the clearing. The swing creaked, and the shadows stepped closer. Story 6. The handprint tent. The trail was perfect, rugged, isolated, and deep in the wilderness of Washington State. Sam had been planning this solo trip for months, yearning for the peace and quiet only the forest could offer. He was no novice camper. He'd trekked through the Rockies, scaled portions of the Appalachian Trail, and spent nights under the stars without another soul for miles. This trip was supposed to be the same. By the third day, Sam was miles from the nearest marked campsite. He set up his tent in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, their dense needles filtering the sunlight into soft beams that danced across the ground. His campfire crackled as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. Sam woke abruptly, unsure what had disturbed his sleep. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows on the inside of his tent. He grabbed his flashlight, clicked it on, and swept the beam around. Everything inside was as it should be. His backpack, boots, and knife were all in their places. But outside, the world felt off. There was no wind, no rustle of leaves, no chirp of crickets, just silence, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. He lay back down, convincing himself it was nothing. He'd camped in silent stretches of wilderness before. The unease gnawed at him, but he eventually drifted back to sleep. The morning brought answers Sam didn't want. As he unzipped his tent, sunlight spilled inside, and he froze. The outside of his tent was covered in muddy handprints. They weren't human. Each print was enormous, fingers too long, palms too wide, with deep grooves where claws should have been. They smeared across the fabric in erratic patterns, some trailing down as if something had been dragging its hands along the material. Sam's stomach turned. He crouched low and scanned the ground. The earth was soft from recent rain, and the prints extended outward in every direction. They weren't boot prints or paw marks, but something in between. He tried to laugh it off. Maybe a bear had been curious. Maybe the mud and his own fear made the prints look stranger than they were. But bears didn't leave handprints. The day passed uneventfully, though the eerie quiet persisted. Even as Sam hiked to gather more firewood, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows between the trees seemed darker, the air heavier. By dusk, he convinced himself to stay one more night. Whatever had left the handprints was probably long gone. He built a larger fire than the night before, hoping its glow would keep the unease at bay. That hope shattered around midnight. The first sound was breathing, heavy, labored, and close. Sam bolted upright, clutching his flashlight. He stayed perfectly still, straining to hear over the thundering of his heart. The breathing came again, low and guttural, accompanied by the soft crunch of footsteps circling the tent. He whispered to himself, trying to stay calm. It's just an animal, probably a deer, or maybe The scratching started, long, deliberate drags against the fabric of his tent, moving slowly around its perimeter. Sam gripped his knife, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The fire outside was still burning. He could see its faint glow through the tent walls. Then the scratching stopped, The silence was worse. Sam crouched lower, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. He debated what to do. Should he yell? Make himself seem bigger, louder? Or stay silent and hope it moved on? Before he could decide, the breathing returned, right outside the tent flap. Summoning every ounce of courage, Sam yanked the zipper down and burst out of the tent, flashlight and knife raised. The clearing was empty. His fire was still crackling, the flames casting flickering light across the trees. The silence pressed down on him, so thick it felt like a physical weight. Then he saw it. At the edge of the firelight, just beyond the reach of the flames, stood a figure. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, hunched slightly as if the bulk of its body was too much to bear. Its limbs were long and sinewy, covered in matted fur that glistened as though damp. The face was a grotesque mix of human and beast, sunken eyes that glowed faintly, a mouth filled with jagged teeth, and nostrils that flared as it sniffed the air. Sam froze. The creature tilted its head, studying him. Its hand, those enormous clawed hands, twitched at its sides, the fingers curling and uncurling as if itching to grab. Sam's instincts kicked in. He backed toward the fire, keeping the light between them. The creature didn't move, but its gaze followed him, unblinking. "Stay back," Sam muttered, his voice barely audible. He grabbed a burning log from the fire and waved it in front of him. The creature flinched but didn't retreat. Then it smiled. The expression was all wrong, too wide, too full of malice. It leaned forward, claws digging into the dirt, and let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through Sam's chest. Sam didn't wait to see what happened next. He hurled the burning log toward the creature and bolted into the woods, his flashlight bouncing wildly. He ran blindly, branches slashing at his arms and face. The forest seemed endless, every tree a potential hiding spot for the thing that had been watching him. Behind him, he heard the crash of heavy footsteps, the snapping of branches as the creature pursued him. Sam ran until his legs burned, until his lungs felt like they would burst. He didn't stop until he reached a ranger station at dawn, collapsing on the porch in a heap. When the rangers returned with him to the campsite later that day, there was no sign of the creature. The tent was shredded, the fire long extinguished. But the muddy handprints were still there, smeared across the fabric like a warning. The rangers chalked it up to a bear attack, but Sam knew better. He never went camping alone again. Story 7. The campground that disappeared. The sun was sinking low in the sky when Mark and his 3 friends, Ellen, Jake, and Sarah, finally reached their destination. The trail had been rough, winding through thick brush and dense woods for hours, but the promise of a secluded campsite deep in the forest had been too tempting to resist. They were looking for peace and quiet, away from the noise of the world, away from the stress of their everyday lives. The kind of peace that could only be found at a hidden campground, where the sound of traffic and cell phones were just a distant memory. Mark was the one who had suggested it. He'd heard about the place from an old hiking book, a spot so secluded it wasn't listed on any modern maps. It was said to be an untouched paradise, a perfect place to disconnect from everything. The moment they arrived at the campground, something felt off. At first, it was just the silence, The air seemed unnaturally still, and even the birds had stopped singing. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and their boots crunching on the dry ground. "Doesn't this place feel empty?" Sarah asked, glancing around the clearing. "I think that's the point," Jake replied, trying to sound cheerful. "We're in the middle of nowhere. It's supposed to be quiet." But as they set up their tents and unpacked their gear, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The campsite wasn't just quiet, it was abandoned. The fire pits were overgrown with weeds, and the picnic tables had rotted. They were crumbling under the weight of years of neglect. There was no sign of anyone having been here for a long time. No recent footprints, no traces of trash or used campsites. "Maybe it was an old campground," Ellen suggested, trying to ease the tension. "Maybe they shut it down years ago." "Yeah, maybe," Mark said, though he wasn't convinced. He'd read that the campground had been active up until only a few years ago, but he didn't want to ruin the mood. He had promised his friends a peaceful weekend in the woods, and he wasn't going to let a little weirdness spoil that. After setting up camp, they gathered around the fire pit and started to cook dinner, trying to ignore the strange feeling that clung to the air. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the forest around them seemed to grow even quieter, the shadows stretching long and dark. Then, just as they were finishing their meal, they heard it, a soft murmur, like voices carried on the wind. "Did you hear that?" Ellen asked, her eyes wide. Mark looked around, his heart rate picking up. He hadn't heard anything at first, but now that Ellen had pointed it out, he could hear it too, a faint, almost inaudible sound, like distant chatter, maybe laughter. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods, but it was hard to tell. "Probably just some animals," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. He sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as the others. Nothing to worry about. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something, was out there, just beyond the reach of the firelight. He stood up, scanning the trees. The sound was faint, but it was definitely there. A soft whisper, like people talking, too far away to make out any words but close enough to feel unsettling. "What do you think it is?" Sarah asked, her voice low, barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Mark said, his throat dry. "Maybe other campers? It's possible we're not the only ones here." He hated that he was trying to rationalize it. The thought of other campers, maybe lost or camping too far into the woods, was a comforting idea. But deep down, he knew it didn't make sense. The trail to this place was long, winding, and difficult. Why would anyone else be out here? As the night wore on, the voices seemed to grow louder, closer, but no one ever appeared. No other campers came into view, no lights from other tents. Only the soft crackling of their own fire and the occasional rustle of branches in the breeze. It wasn't until later, when the fire was dying down and the stars filled the sky, that the strange lights appeared. Mark was the first to notice them, faint flickers of light, like lanterns or flashlights, dancing just at the edge of the trees. They moved in and out of view, weaving between the trunks, as though someone was walking between them, lighting the way with lanterns. The lights blinked on and off, but the campers didn't hear footsteps or any other sounds to suggest someone was out there. "Are you seeing that?" Ellen asked, her voice barely a whisper. Yeah, Jake said, his eyes wide with disbelief. I thought I was imagining it. The lights continued to flicker, moving in an almost deliberate pattern, as if they were circling the campsite. Mark couldn't help but feel like they were being watched, like someone or something was observing them from the dark. The flickering lights only intensified the sense of unease growing in his stomach. I think we should go inside the tents, Sarah said, her voice shaky. This feels wrong. But before they could move, a shadow passed across the clearing. It wasn't the shadow of a tree or a bush, but something more solid, something large, humanoid. It moved quickly, disappearing into the darkness as soon as it appeared. No one moved, Mark whispered. His heart pounded in his chest. Stay still. The shadow was followed by a rustling sound, faint but growing louder. The voices returned, this time clearer, more distinct. They weren't just talking, they were laughing, and the sound grew louder, almost deafening. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the voices seemed to swirl around them, rising in pitch and volume as the laughter echoed off the trees. Suddenly, the lights blinked out. The fire flared brightly for a moment and then dimmed. A cold wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing the flames. The laughter stopped, and the voices faded into an eerie, suffocating silence. Mark turned to his friends. We need to go. Now. Without saying another word, the four of them scrambled into their tents, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that something was out there, watching them. They huddled together, hearts racing, listening to the strange sounds around them. When dawn finally broke, the campers emerged from their tents, hoping the night's terror had been nothing more than a bad dream. But as they looked around, the reality of the situation hit them. The campground was gone. The tents were still there, but the fire pit, the picnic tables, and the overgrown paths, they were all gone. In their place was nothing but trees, an endless forest stretching as far as the eye could see. The clearing had vanished, leaving them stranded in an unfamiliar part of the woods. The trail they had followed to get here had disappeared, replaced by a thick tangle of trees and brush. Mark's heart sank as he tried to make sense of what had happened. This isn't right. This isn't the same place we camped. What do we do now? Sarah asked, panic rising in her voice. We have to find the trail, Mark said, trying to stay calm. There has to be a way out. But as they began to walk, they realized something even more terrifying. The forest stretched on in every direction, and they couldn't find a way out. The familiar landmarks, trees, rocks, the river they had passed, were nowhere to be found. The forest was unchanged, untouched, and infinite. It was as if the campground had never existed, as if it had been swallowed whole by the wilderness. And the voices? They were still there, faint but present, just out of reach. Laughter, whispers, and soft murmurs of things they couldn't see, things that were watching them. As the day wore on, Mark, Ellen, Jake, and Sarah realized that they were no longer just lost. They were trapped. The campground that had been there only hours before was gone, and they were stranded in a forest that seemed to have no end, a place where time had stopped and the woods themselves had swallowed them whole. And they weren't alone. The forest had always been watching. Story 8, The Howling Wind. The plateau sat high above the rest of the world, its windswept surface exposed to the elements. It was a place of desolation, far from civilization, but perfect for a family looking to disconnect from their everyday lives. Jim and Sarah had decided to take their two kids, Ben and Emily, on a camping trip in the mountains, hoping for a peaceful weekend. They'd rented a small cabin the night before, but that morning, they decided to hike out to the plateau for a more secluded experience. The wind greeted them as they arrived. It was fierce, unforgiving. The air had that sharp, biting cold to it, the kind that makes your eyes water and your breath visible in the air. But it was also exhilarating, the kind of wind that felt like it was sweeping away the past, allowing you to start fresh. The plateau was barren, dotted only with scattered patches of dry grass and jagged rocks. In the distance, the mountains loomed like ancient sentinels, their peaks covered in snow. They pitched their tent at the far edge of the plateau, near a cluster of stones that seemed to form a natural windbreak. It was a quiet spot, peaceful, even, but there was something about it that felt off. Jim couldn't place it at first. Sarah was busy making sure their camp was set up while Ben and Emily explored the area, laughing and shouting as they ran through the grass. The sound of their voices seemed to fade with the wind, swallowed up by the vast emptiness of the plateau. That night, as the sun began to sink behind the mountains, the wind picked up. It howled through the plateau, rattling the tents and whistling between the rocks. The family sat around the campfire, huddled together for warmth, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange light. At first, it was just the wind, howling like a pack of wolves in the distance, a sound so familiar it was almost comforting. But as the night deepened, something changed. The howling didn't stop. Instead, it grew louder, closer. It rose and fell in waves, like a living creature trying to speak through the wind. Jim thought he heard something different in the sound, something that wasn't quite right. There was a strange desperation in it, an anguish that he couldn't quite explain. At first, he brushed it off. Wolves, perhaps, maybe coyotes. They were common in these parts, and the wind could play tricks on the mind, especially at night. But as the hours went by, the howling grew more distinct. It didn't sound like wolves anymore. It sounded like someone or something in pain. "Dad, what's that?" Ben asked, his voice small, almost lost in the wind. Jim turned to his son, trying to mask the unease in his voice. "It's nothing, buddy. Just the wind." But even as he said it, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The howling was too human now, too filled with sorrow and despair. It echoed in the distance, and then, as if it was moving closer, it seemed to swirl around them. The wind cut through the plateau in unnatural directions, circling their campsite, pushing the air in waves. Jim tried to keep his mind focused on the fire, on the crackling wood, on the sound of his family's voices, but it wasn't easy. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the howling stopped. A suffocating silence took its place. The wind stilled, and the air grew thick, heavy with an oppressive weight. Jim felt his heart race, a bead of sweat running down his back despite the cold. The fire flickered and cracked, but that was the only sound, nothing else. Sarah looked up from her book. "Did you hear that?" The wind had stopped. Before Jim could answer, a voice echoed out of the darkness, a voice so quiet, yet sharp enough to cut through the stillness. "Leave now." The words were clear, though they came from nowhere. There was no one in sight, nothing to explain the voice. Jim's stomach twisted, and his breath caught in his throat. Sarah's face went pale, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Who's there?" Jim called out, standing up quickly, his pulse pounding in his ears. Nothing. No answer. "Who was that?" Emily whispered, clutching her mother's arm. Ben was staring into the shadows, his eyes wide with fear. "Just the wind," Jim said, but even he didn't believe it. There was something in that voice, something that didn't belong here, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. They sat there in silence for a long time, none of them willing to speak. The wind began to pick up again, but it was a different kind of wind now, colder, harsher. It whipped around their campsite, causing the tent to flap violently against the stakes. Jim could hear his heart pounding in his chest, feel the weight of the air pressing in on them. The fire sputtered in the gusts, casting strange, flickering shadows across the plateau. They tried to ignore it, tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. But sleep was difficult that night. Every creak of the tent, every rustle of the grass seemed amplified, as if the world had been reduced to nothing but their campsite and the ominous sounds that circled around them. When morning finally came, it was a relief. The sun broke through the clouds, and the wind had died down. The family was exhausted, but they tried to keep things normal. They had breakfast, packed up their gear, and prepared to head back to the cabin. But as Jim unzipped the tent and stepped outside, his stomach dropped. Around their campsite, fresh clawed footprints had appeared in the dirt. They were deep, as though something heavy had been walking around the tent during the night. The prints were unlike any animal tracks Jim had ever seen. Too large for a bear, too narrow for a mountain lion. They looked almost human, but twisted, like the claws of some monstrous creature. "Dad," Ben said, his voice trembling. "What are those?" Jim didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Any explanation, but nothing made sense. The prints led away from the tent, toward the edge of the plateau, where the cliffs dropped off into nothingness. The marks disappeared at the edge, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her face pale. Jim turned to look at her. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of it made his blood run cold. "We leave," he said, his voice tight. "Now." They packed up quickly, too quickly, hardly speaking, as if the presence that had haunted them during the night was still there, lurking just out of sight. As they hiked back down the plateau, the wind picked up again, but it didn't sound the same. It wasn't howling anymore, but it whispered through the trees, low and mournful, as if it were calling them back. They didn't stop until they reached the safety of the cabin. But Jim knew one thing for sure. They had been lucky. Whatever was out there on that plateau, whatever had whispered to them in the night, it was still waiting for the next family to wander too close, to listen to the wind and hear its sorrowful, painful call. And when they did, it would be too late to run. Story 9. The Forgotten Camp Counselor. The sun was beginning to set over the woods as the group of teenagers, all eager for their summer camping trip, set up their tents at a secluded camp in the mountains. It was a small, forgotten place tucked deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. The old wood cabins, mostly empty, stood like sentinels watching over the grounds. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air, and there was an unsettling quiet that blanketed the camp, almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath. It was their first night in the camp, and the group of friends gathered around the campfire, laughing and joking. They were the only campers there that week, having the entire place to themselves. As the flames crackled, casting an orange glow over their faces, one of them, Sarah, spoke up. "Have you guys heard the story about the camp counselor?" The others fell silent for a moment, the sudden shift in her tone making them uneasy. They had heard the rumors, of course, but it wasn't the kind of story they had planned to share around the fire. "What story?" Mark asked, glancing over at Sarah, his curiosity piqued. "It's a ghost story," Sarah said, her voice dropping lower. "You guys know this camp has been around for a long time, right? But not many people come here anymore. Back in the 80s, there was a counselor named Greg. He was popular with the kids, always smiling, always willing to help. But one day, he went on a hike by himself, and he never came back." "A counselor went missing?" Emily asked, her voice skeptical. She pulled her hoodie tighter around her shoulders, suddenly feeling the cool air of the evening creeping in. "Yeah, but that's not the weird part," Sarah continued. "The weird part is that no one ever found him. No trace of him. Not a footprint, not a piece of clothing, nothing. The police searched for days, but they just gave up. Some people say he wandered off, lost in the woods. But others say something happened to him out there. They say he's still out there, wandering the forest, looking for people." Sarah let the words hang in the air, a cold wind rustling through the trees. The group fell quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts. Mark, trying to lighten the mood, scoffed and tossed a stick into the fire. "Ghost stories aren't real. We're here to have fun, not get freaked out." "I don't know," said Emily, shivering despite herself. "Something about this place feels off. I keep hearing weird noises in the trees, like whispers. Probably just the wind," Mark said, rolling his eyes. "And besides, it's just a story. We're here for 3 days. What could happen?" But Sarah wasn't so sure. She stared into the fire, her eyes distant, as though seeing something in the flames that the others couldn't. That night, the group settled into their tents, their conversations fading as the night deepened. The sounds of the forest became more pronounced, the wind whispering through the trees, the distant hoots of owls. But there was something else too, something quiet but insistent, a soft, shuffling sound that seemed to come from just beyond the light of their campfire. It was like footsteps, but not quite, more like the dragging of boots over leaves and dirt. At first, they all thought it was just the wind or an animal moving through the woods. But the sound continued, growing closer and closer. By midnight, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her sleeping bag, staring at the zipper of her tent, listening to the shuffling sounds just beyond the trees. Her heart was racing, her body stiff with unease. It wasn't just the noise. It was something else, a feeling, a presence. Then it happened. The sound stopped. Dead silence. And then, from the shadows beyond the firelight, a figure appeared. At first, Sarah thought it was one of her friends playing a prank. But as the figure stepped closer, she realized something was wrong. The figure was pale, almost translucent, and dressed in an old camp counselor uniform, the kind worn decades ago. The uniform was frayed, worn at the edges, and the figure's face was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare into her soul. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, but no sound escaped. The figure was muttering something, its voice incoherent, like words from another time, words that didn't make sense. It took another step forward, and she could see the pale, lifeless hands hanging at its sides. Sarah scrambled to unzip her tent, her hands trembling. She knew she had to wake the others. But when she peeked out, the figure was gone. "Sarah, you okay?" Emily's voice came from the neighboring tent, groggy and confused. Sarah couldn't speak. She was frozen in place, her heart hammering in her chest. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words were stuck in her throat. "Sarah?" Emily asked again, this time more urgently. "What's going on?" Before Sarah could answer, the shuffling noise returned, louder this time, as though someone was circling their campsite. The tension was unbearable. Sarah, still unable to move, turned to look at the others. Mark and Emily had heard it too now. They were sitting up, peering out of their tents, eyes wide with fear. "Who's out there?" Mark called, his voice shaky. There was no answer, only the soft shuffle of boots on dirt. "Just stay inside. Don't go out there," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The air seemed to grow colder by the second. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped again. The next morning, Sarah was the first to leave her tent. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread hanging over her, and as she stepped outside, she could see the others already awake, standing around the campfire. "Did anyone hear anything last night?" Emily asked, her voice small and uncertain. Mark rubbed his eyes. "I thought I heard something, but I didn't see anything. It was probably just an animal or something." Sarah wasn't so sure. As the group sat around the campfire, Sarah noticed something strange near the trees, something that hadn't been there the night before. There were footprints, large and uneven, leading out into the forest. But these were no ordinary footprints. They were too deep, as though something heavy had walked through the soft earth. Something large enough to leave marks that looked unnatural, almost claw-like. "That wasn't there last night," Sarah said, her voice tight. "What is that?" Emily asked, staring at the footprints. "I don't know," Sarah whispered, "but I think it's him." The others stared at her, not understanding, but Sarah knew. She had seen it last night. That figure, that pale ghost wearing the old counselor's uniform, it wasn't just a ghost. It was something more, something that fed on fear, something that had been waiting all these years to draw them in. That afternoon, they decided to leave early, packing their things and heading for the trail back to the car. But as they walked, they felt the unmistakable sensation that they were being watched. The woods around them seemed too quiet, the air too still. Then, just before they reached the edge of the forest, something caught Sarah's eye. a figure standing far in the distance, near the trees. It was the same figure, the counselor, but this time there was no mistaking what it was. As the figure turned to face them, Sarah could see its face more clearly, its hollow eyes staring with hunger, its mouth stretched in an unnatural grin. Before they could run, the figure lunged toward them, its eyes burning with the power of all the fear it had accumulated over the years. And just like that, one of them, Emily, was gone, without a trace, vanished into the forest. They never found her. The rest of the group left that night, terrified and broken. No one spoke of what had happened, but they all knew the camp counselor wasn't a ghost. It was something that had been waiting, and it would wait again. And as the years passed, the stories continued. The camp remained forgotten, but sometimes, late at night, those brave enough to camp near the woods heard the shuffling of boots, the faint sound of a voice whispering, incoherent words carried by the wind. And they knew, deep in their bones, that the counselor was still out there, still waiting. Story 10. The Tree That Watches. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as 7 friends made their way deeper into the forest, their laughter echoing through the trees. It was supposed to be the perfect camping trip, an escape from the noise of the world, a few days spent in the secluded wilderness, miles away from cell phones, emails, and responsibilities. They had found an idyllic spot by a small creek, a place that felt untouched, like the forest had kept it a secret for years. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple, the friends set up camp. They built a fire, unpacked their gear, and settled around the flickering flames, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories. The atmosphere was light, filled with the easy camaraderie of people who had known each other for years. But one thing stood out about this campsite that none of them could shake: the tree, a massive oak, older than any of them could guess, stood a few yards away, its bark dark and gnarled. It seemed to loom over them, casting long shadows as if it was watching. The trunk was wide enough to fit 2 grown men, and its branches stretched out like skeletal arms. At first, no one said anything about it. It was just a tree after all, but every time they looked toward it, they couldn't shake the feeling that it was moving ever so slightly, as if breathing. Jake, the most skeptical of the group, dismissed it as a trick of the wind. "You're all just being paranoid," he said, nudging his friend Mark as he passed a marshmallow over the fire. Trees don't move, but there was something unsettling about the way the tree stood in the dying light, its hollowed-out trunk seeming to shift in a way that made the friends uneasy. It wasn't until later, when the fire had burned low and the forest had grown quiet, that the strange events began to unfold. Night fell, the wind had died down, and the forest was eerily still, almost too still. The only sounds were the occasional crackle from the dying fire and the distant hoot of an owl. The group had gathered inside their tents, exhausted from the long hike earlier that day. But sleep didn't come easy. There was something about the silence that made it feel like the world had paused, like something was holding its breath, waiting. Around midnight, Mark was the first to hear it, a faint rustling sound outside his tent. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and listened. There was nothing. His heart began to race, and the hairs on the back of his neck prickled. The noise came again, this time louder, almost like something was dragging itself across the ground. He reached for his flashlight, his fingers trembling. Slowly, he unzipped the tent and poked his head out, his light sweeping across the campsite. At first, he saw nothing but the dark outlines of trees and the soft glow of the dying fire. But then his gaze settled on the massive oak, and he froze. Something was oozing from the hollow in the tree's trunk. At first, Mark thought it was just sap, but as he watched, the sap began to pool and form shapes, twisting and warping. His breath caught in his throat when he realized what the sap was forming. An eye. The sap had pooled together to create the unmistakable shape of an eye, large and unblinking. The darkness around it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if the tree was watching him, waiting. Mark's heart began to thud painfully in his chest. He felt the overwhelming urge to look away, but something kept him staring, entranced by the glistening, otherworldly eye. "Mark," came a voice from behind him, snapping him out of his trance. He turned quickly, his flashlight jerking toward the sound, and found Jake standing there, still in his sleeping bag. His eyes were wide, fear written all over his face. "Did you see it too?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. Jake nodded, his face pale. "I don't know what it is, but that tree is wrong." Without another word, they both turned to look back at the oak. The eye was still there, watching them. They could feel its gaze, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on them like a weight. Mark felt sick, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "We need to leave," Jake said, his voice tight. "Now." But as the two of them began to pack their things quickly, the forest around them seemed to come alive. First, the roots of the tree began to stir. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a slight shift in the earth beneath the massive oak. But then the roots started to crawl. Slowly, they crept toward Mark and Jake, twisting and writhing like serpents. The roots began to pull themselves out of the ground, dragging heavy chunks of earth with them, until they were just feet away from the edge of the campfire's light. "Run!" Mark shouted, his voice rising in panic. Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed his backpack and bolted, but as soon as he turned, the ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble, the roots reaching out to grab at his ankles. He barely managed to leap out of the way, his heart pounding in his chest. As the two of them ran, they could hear the others stirring in their tents, confusion and panic setting in. "What's going on?" Sarah shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "What's happening?" Mark turned back, shouting, "The tree! Get out of here!" But it was too late. The roots had already begun to spread across the campsite. They surged forward, wrapping around tents, dragging them into the earth. The branches of the oak began to sway violently, even though there was no wind. The tree's gnarled limbs twisted and contorted as if trying to reach out and grab them. The forest was alive, and it was angry. The friends scrambled to grab their things, but the more they struggled, the more the roots seemed to move, tightening around their legs, pulling them down. One by one, the roots grabbed hold of them, yanking them into the darkness. They screamed, but their voices were muffled by the dense canopy of trees, their cries swallowed by the living forest. Jake and Mark ran blindly through the trees, branches slapping their faces. But no matter how fast they ran, they couldn't escape. The trees, the roots, the very earth itself seemed to bend toward them, closing in around them. Every time they thought they had broken free, they would turn a corner, only to find themselves back at the oak tree. The eyes of the tree followed them, watching, unblinking. The roots seemed to pulse with its every breath. By morning, the campsite was gone, swallowed by the earth. The trees stood tall and silent, their shadows stretching long across the forest floor. The only evidence that the friends had ever been there were the faint impressions of their footprints in the dirt, and the tree, still standing, watching, waiting for the next unwitting campers to find its hollowed trunk. But those who passed by it on the trail noticed something strange. The tree's eye was gone. In its place, the bark had closed up as if it had never been there at all. And the forest remained as it always had been, silent, still, and alive.